Welcome back to Salesforce Mojo. Today we're going to be going over creating custom components inside of the new LWR checkout. Now this is going to work for both the B2B to C and the B2B template. What we're going to be going through today is a little bit about the different type of checkouts we have available, the pros and cons and why we would go with LWR, and then we're going to get into the meat of it. We're actually going to get into creating a couple of custom components. So if you're interested in how to utilize this new checkout and creating custom components, stick around, we're going to be jumping right into it. So as of the recording of this video, there really are two primary ways to go through checkout depending on which template you're a part of. Up to this point, we've primarily been doing B2B Aura-based checkout, and that's been with the existing template, and we're using flow in that. And we've kind of gone through a couple of examples of how to extend the existing checkout flow, how to really use the power that's there. However, with some of the changes that are happening with B2B LWR, checkout is starting to evolve there as well. And we've shown a couple of snapshots of what that looks like. It's been termed unified checkout in a couple of places, but it's really the checkout is now in Experience Cloud and configurable there. We no longer have to use flows in order to interact with checkout inside of our B2B commerce instance. So before I get too far into it, I just want to take a quick second and say, what are some of the pros and cons and maybe why we went down this path or why Salesforce has gotten down this path? When you look at the difference between the flow-based checkout and when you look at the checkout using LWC and the components there, I think one of the big reasons that we're going in this direction, and again, a little speculation here, but I believe it's around performance and speed and configurability. So if you look at kind of the performance between the two different checkouts, LWR is way faster. And definitely some of that's to do with the template architecture difference from the Aura one, but some of it definitely has to do with the components versus the flow-based mentality here. So I think there's some of that. On top of that, there definitely is some desire to have this more point and click and on a single page. Versus having to do more admin flow-based work and having to kind of stretch this across multiple pages there. So there could be a lot of different reasons and more that I didn't list, but those are just some of my thoughts as I've kind of been diving into this B2B LWR checkout experience. So what I plan to do in this video is give you kind of where things are at right now and give you a lot of my opinions on kind of how to go forward with using the checkout based on the information that's available right now. I will caveat that this is all really new for everyone right now. So the things I say on here may not be 100% correct. They're my opinion in a lot of cases. And this may change 1,000 times over the next couple of weeks, months, and years. So take it with a grain of salt, and I hope this kind of helps you guys get into the mentality. So with that, let's really get into what this looks like. Okay, so in today's video, we're going to be going over two examples. One of them is a terms component that is available actually on their documentation, which I'll show you here in a little bit. Although I've made a couple of modifications to make it work, I think a little bit better, or at least the way that I like to work with these components. And the second one that I intend to go over is a replication of the shipping instructions component that comes with both versions of checkout. And I think that will help kind of illustrate the different ways that you can interact with the data. So with that, let's not delay it any longer and let's jump right in. Okay, so here we are back inside of our Salesforce Mojo instance. We're in Experience Builder. I've navigated to the checkout page, as you can see from the top left corner there. And you can see that we're seeing the new unified checkout experience here in LWR. So the first thing that I'll note is that there's a little bit of customization that can be done about the look and feel. One of the big advantages of this checkout component is that it's all on a single page, but you do have some flexibility on how you actually want to represent this to your users. You can definitely keep the one-page layout, which is the default one that comes with it. And this gives you different sections, so you can definitely hop into edit checkout sections and you see we have a shipping method, and a payment. Those are the required sections that kind of build the data that you need in order to complete a checkout and move into order. But you can also add more sections here as well. So you can see we have those on here, in those different respective areas. And that's, that's great. That's kind of the standard one. There also is the capability of having an accordion layout. And so if I click over here, you'll see that the experience changes a bit. You'll see the first one opens up here as shipping address. But as we scroll down, we no longer see each section opened up. We can see shipping method and payments as sections, but they won't open actually until we move from one to the other. Now, it's really a debate on when you'll plan on using each one of these, and I think it'll kind of be a customer by customer basis. But the way I'd use this is if you have a really long checkout section with a lot of information you need to gather or more complexity, you might lean more towards the accordion to kind of minimize the view and make it more digestible. And if you have something simple, you might lean more towards the one-page layout so the user can see everything. You do need to make this determination first, though, because which of these you actually choose will determine how these custom components will actually interact with the checkout capability. So that's probably a good place for us to pivot over into Salesforce's documentation. First, I'll note that you see that we have a wrapper checkout component here, and then we have a lot of components inside of it. So keep that in mind as we go over here. I'm now on the developer Salesforce guide here. We're again in the B2B commerce and B2B2C commerce developer guide section. But you can see down on the left-hand side, we're underneath the build custom component section. And there's actually a section on building custom checkout components. Now, I wouldn't say this has everything you need, but it has enough to kind of get going and a little bit of hints of actually how to use some of the interfaces as we're starting to build more of these documents. The first thing you should do is you should go into the checkout component hierarchy. And this gives you a good representation of how the component structures are actually used. So that checkout wrapper component I mentioned, that's kind of the top level checkout component. You notice that there are checkout sections, and you can see that there's child components inside of it. And right now, the way that this is constructed is that every single one of these child components has this interface called checkout savable. And checkout savable gives the capability to kind of interact between each other and back up to the parent component. Now, I know that's the way the standard one does, and I believe there's a way to do this with custom components as well. In these custom components I created, I didn't implement the checkable save out interface. Instead, I directly interface with a couple of the hooks, which I'll show in a minute here. But I think there's a variant way of doing this. But kind of the key here is that you are within the single page checkout, you need to be able to interact with the different sections depending on what you're doing so that when you click place order at the bottom, it doesn't place an order without required information that you need for your users. And that's another good thing to call out as we go back here. If I go back over to one page for a moment here, you can see that the parent component is actually the one that owns the button, the place order button. So in this kind of standard experience, we don't own the capability of having our own button with our own logic there. That needs to be done at the subcomponent level. So that means if you add a new component here for shipping instructions, and in your case, shipping instructions are required, you need to make sure that the component lets the parent checkout know that you can't complete checkout until that instruction's done. And there's ways to do that, but that's kind of a shift in mentality than how we've previously done it with checkout in Flow, because in Flow, you just wouldn't move to the next screen until you get all the information you need. And it's kind of a chunk by chunk experience. But now we're kind of on this single page here, and we need to start kind of reframing our mind of how we're actually using the data and the components here. So just to spend one more moment here before we actually jump into the code here, and I promise that's what's next, is this second or third actually section underneath the same custom component checkout documentation. It goes through a couple of, I think, really good information about the different sections and layout options and how this actually works between the accordion layout and the one-page layout. But you can see that it will go through in a little bit of detail of like, you need to use the check validity here, and it has a place order, and it has a report validity. And those are the API hooks that we will talk about as we get into our actual example, because this is how you interact with the place order capability, how you ensure that information is available to that parent component and doesn't proceed. So I think it's really good to go down here. You can see there's a couple of diagrams for the one-page layout, for instance. There's one for the accordion layout. Again, it doesn't have everything, but it has a pretty good start of what this actually looks like and how to report any errors. And the first component we're going to do is the terms component. And you can see that they have an example here and actually what it looks like. And if you scroll down, they have the HTML here, they have the JavaScript, and you can pretty much pull this in right into your instance, and it will work for most cases. I'll show a couple of things that I modified here, but really this is the start of where we're going to go. So let's jump right into it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new Lightning Web component. We're going to call this terms. And what we're actually going to start with is I'm going to drop in some of the code that I've updated of this actual component init version, and I'll walk you through some of the changes here just to not have you guys have to watch me draw this out and actually type. All right, so I've dropped in the actual code for each one of these components here, and I'll just walk us through, at a high level what this is doing. This terms component is actually pretty simple. So if we hop over to the HTML, we can see that it's really just an input with a little bit of description of what that input is with a little bit of capability of error, and that's really the extent of it. You will notice if you're comparing this side by side with what's in the documentation, if I scroll back up to the HTML section, this does vary just a tad bit. You can see in the template right here, it just has template. My version has the LWC render mode in it. I notice there's a small little bug going on right this moment that if you don't have that in there, it actually doesn't show the component. It's like a little minified input on the left-hand side that you really can't see at all. I've been assured that's a bug and you won't need that moving forward, but if you're doing this like today or in the next couple of weeks or months, you might want to try adding that into it to get rid of that issue. However, so this is kind of a really simple component. We'll go back to the JavaScript because this is where all the magic's happening here. We have a couple of variables up here that we'll be using down below. The one that I will call out that's really important here is the checkout mode. Now, the checkout mode is what you use to interact with Salesforce and that parent checkout component. And depending on if you're using JavaScript or TypeScript, the value for this will differ a little bit. So if we hop back over to our documentation, inside of the checkout savable interface, we can scroll down and we can see it has a little bit of description of what these are. If you're using TypeScript, it's future edit disabled summary stencil. If you're using JavaScript, it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And these allow you to know what state you're in. So whether if you're in an accordion, for instance, if you're in an edit state or you're in a non-edit state, you will be able to tell that because it will give you a 1 or a 2 or a 3, for instance. When I was doing this, I found that I was using these three the most, and I haven't really came across a use case of the stencil or the future yet, but that's really how you will interact with the checkout mode. So you can see that I've defined checkout mode here as 1 to start with. If I scroll down, you can see that I have an API get and a set for checkout mode. And so to start with, I'm getting the current mode for this component. So I'm returning that. It's starting with edit because I want it started in the edit mode. And then based on where I'm at in the context of the parent checkout, it's going to give me updated information for where I should be at. So this is one of the places where I added a little bit here. And is this the perfect way to do it or the best way to do it? Probably not. There's probably 1,000 ways to do this. I found this to be this most straightforward for kind of what I was trying to do for demonstration purposes. But I'm basically capturing the value of the checkout mode when it's set by that parent container, and based on whatever value is given to me, I'm either disabling or re-enabling the information. Let's actually publish this into the instance, and we'll drop that in the community, and I'll show you what this actually looks like. All right, we're back in our community now, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually switch it over to the accordion mode because I feel like that gives a pretty good description of how these modes work and how to really interact with them. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to add a new section. Let's call this custom section as something super creative here. And we'll call this next. And I'm actually going to move this up right underneath address. Now, one of the things you do want to keep in mind is there's certain requirements you have to have before payment. So for instance, shipping address and shipping method need to happen before payment because payment requires that information. So you want to keep that in mind as you're kind of dragging and dropping these around if you see any errors that way. Now, once we have that in there, I'm going to scroll down and I will select custom section here because that's the section I want to edit right now. And if I go over to components, I should see a component called terms and condition, which I do see. And once I drag that in here, I will see my terms and condition. And if I click into it, you can see that you have some nice attributes they've given you out of the box as part of that component, which is pretty great. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this. And once it's published, I'm going to log in as my user here in a moment. And we'll come back when I'm logged in here. All right, perfect. So I'm logged in as myself here. And I can see that I have a custom section down below that we added. And I'm going to hit it, click next here. And you can see that the sections kind of remain. There we go. It took a second to load here, but you can see the sections kind of remain open as you go through, but in a different state, which is an interesting clarification here. So you can see that the first one, if I go back up to edit, it kind of reopens. The experience changes a bit, but when I click next, it locks down because that's done and you're supposed to be working in the custom section. So if we're building custom components, we probably want to do something similar. And that's the changes I made with that switch and the capability to kind of listen for that checkout mode for two reasons. One is I need to know if I'm in a current edit state and if I'm in a summary state or disabled state. The next thing we need to do here is I want this to always be accepted. So there needs to be a little bit of validity that happens before you move on. So if I go ahead and click next, you can see that that is doing that. So let's jump back over to our code for a moment and we'll scroll down and you can see in here, we're implementing a couple different APIs here. We have a check validity and we have a report validity and we have the checkout save and we have place order and we have handle change here. So a couple different things that we're doing. One of the big ones here is place order. You can see that it's using the report validity here. And this report validity will actually be triggered, and you can see it actually has it in description. On the one page layout, report validity is triggered by clicking the place order. Accordion layout, it is actually triggered when you're clicking into the next section. So that proceed button or the next button there. As I was mentioning, this report validity is really important because we can use it to kind of ensure that before we move on to the next section, things are done properly. So just to be super clear here, report validity, as far as I'm aware and kind of how the way I've seen it in the instance so far, this is triggered when you're moving from section to section if you're using the accordion. The check validity is used when you're placing the order. And so depending on what section or what layout you're using, one page or accordion, it could be used slightly differently. But for instance, this one's really simple. We're saying if the checkout is, or the checkbox in this case is false, then report validity should return false, which means don't move to the section, throw the error. And if it's true, then it allows you to move to that new section. So that's one piece that we're trying to capture. The other thing is we want to, in theory, actually disable that checkbox, right? Because if you're out of the section, you shouldn't be able to check it again. You should go back into the section to check it. So if I check this and click next, you can see that we've moved to the next section. There's a new edit button that pops up on the right-hand side here, and my checkbox is actually disabled. So that's what we've done with this switch that's up here above. We're saying if we're coming across case 2 or 3, which is disabled in summary, then the disabled should be true. And we've wired that disabled is true into the disable of this input. And this allows us to really have that nice clean interaction between the components. But if we go back up, then we need this to be re-enabled, right? So I'm going back from shipping method back into my custom section. We should be able to edit again and go through that full life cycle. So that's kind of how these interfaces work and how you can really use them together with other components and with the parent checkout component. So hopefully that makes sense. That's kind of the one out of the box. The next one we're going to add here is shipping instructions. So let's move over there. All right, so the first thing we're going to do here is create a new component to house the shipping instructions. So I'm going to create a new Lightning Web component. We're going to call this shipping instructions. And I'm going to do the same thing I did last time of bringing over some of the prepared code that I have beforehand, so you guys don't have to watch me write, and then we'll go through each one of the files here in a moment. All right, so we have this in the instance now. If we look at the HTML file, again, this component is pretty straightforward. We have a header here that says it's a shipping instruction section. And then most importantly, we have our input, and really we're just looking to capture any instructions we might have about the shipping details, such as maybe the gate code or the instructions of how to actually get it into the warehouse, whatever that might be. So the HTML is pretty straightforward, but if we go over to the JavaScript here, we have a couple of things going on. I'm going to skip the top section here for a moment. You'll see this section down here below has very similar things to what we did on the terms component. So we're checking the checkout mode here for disabled and re-enabled so we can really manage that in the accordion view. We have the check validity here, and we have the report validity, checkout save, and place order. So those are really all standard for these components as we start to build this out for the checkout screens. So you can see up here at the top, we're doing something a little bit different than the terms one. The terms one is really just it's on or it's off, but in this component, we need to be able to show the existing shipping instructions if I've already made an update there and I'm coming back. And we also need to be able to save this information somewhere that matters. So you can see that we're doing two different things. We're doing first a wire to get the information from Salesforce. And this wire is getting us the information, and we're using that to update a shipping instructions variable. And then on our HTML, we are using that as a value. So that one's pretty straightforward. However, you may wonder, okay, what are you doing a wire on? Well, that's really where this commerce checkout comes in. And so this, in my instance, is a custom Apex class here. If you go up to commerce checkout, and this is what my Apex class looks like. And there is a lot of improvements I can, should, and probably will make at some point to this. But again, really for demonstration purposes, I decided to use the API for this. This is the point where you'll probably wonder, what are my options when it comes to updating this information? Well, from what I can gather, there are really three different options. There is doing this with straight DML and queries. So kind of typical to what you're used to with Lightning Web Components. That still works in a lot of cases here because really what you're doing here is you're updating a record attached to the cart. So you have access to that information. You can create and update fields there. And if you have any level of customization, that's probably the direction you're going to want to go in. Because the second option here that I'm showing is using the APIs, and I'll put a little link into the video here, but we just did a video on using the APIs for checkout. So this is actually using one of those APIs, and it allows you to update those standard fields. Shipping instructions is one of those standard fields that lives on the delivery record. So I was deciding to use that just to show the API route here. But I'm basically getting the information with this endpoint right here, getting that through the through an API request, and then giving it back to my Lightning Web component, which is over here. That's the two ways that are probably going to be the most common. I believe there's actually a third way, and that third way is there's some out-of-the-box capabilities with checkout that allows you to interface with the checkout records. I haven't honestly done too much investigation into that quite yet. There's not a whole lot of documentation out there, but I hear that is potentially going to be an option. But we'll stick with option 1 and 2 for now, just as we're going through this, just to demonstrate that. So that's kind of the get side of this. The update side of this is that we have an event handler here called handle shipping instruction change. And if we go back to our HTML, you can see that on commit, we are basically firing this method, And inside of this method here, we are updating the commerce checkout with the information that we collected and catching that end case there. So same commerce checkout Apex class here, just a different method down here below. And in this one, we are using the web store checkouts active and making a patch to it instead of a get. And so pretty straightforward, things that you'll have seen on that other YouTube video I referenced before. But again, this could be just straight DML and queries to accomplish this. So you do have a couple of options at hand. I'll make one more call out, as I mentioned it in the previous section here, is around this third option. This is the document I'm talking about, Custom Components API in the B2B Commerce and B2B2C Commerce Developer Guide. You can see that it states that there's a couple of standard APIs that assist Lightning Web Components in embodying your kind of brand and themes. Custom Component APIs connect Lightning Web Components with data and execute processes like adding products to cart. So in theory, you could use some of these capabilities. There's some activity ones down here, but as you keep on scrolling, you can see there's a handful of cart ones. So add to cart, update cart, but there's also checkout down here. Authorize payment, create contact point address, load checkout, notify checkout, and more. So there might be some potential to use these if it fits within the box of what you need done. However, what the experience I have and some of the use cases I've seen, a lot of these are customized, and so you likely will have to go down option 1 or 2 that we previously mentioned. All right, we're back on Experience Cloud now. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take that shipping component we just talked about, and we're going to drag it into this checkout section here and make sure everything works correctly. We'll come down to the custom component section and we'll see shipping instructions, which we'll drag up to the section above here. And we don't have any attributes on this, so we should be good to publish this. And once we've published this, we should be able to go to a checkout session and reload the page, and we should be seeing the shipping instructions component on that page. All right, we're back on the checkout page here. So if we click next into our custom section, we do see shipping instructions. Let's make sure everything continues to work with the next. Looks like we still have that requirement there. Let's click that checkbox and we click next, and you'll notice that it did not require us to put in shipping instructions. That's because our component didn't have that logic in there, but we could put that under the one of the report validity functions there, and that would allow us to restrict us from moving forward. So we do see that the other piece of functionality here around disabling was working similar to how the other one was working in the terms component. Let's say that we want to update this to use code 123 to open the gate. And once we do that, it should now fire off to our Apex class. That Apex class will then use the API to go out to Salesforce and actually make that update against this record here. And if we've done everything correctly here, when we refresh, we should see the same instructions we put on here on this record. And you can see that we just reloaded here and we do see that information. I will validate in one more area here because this is using the shipping instructions standard field. So if we go over into our cart that we're using right now, and I believe we're using this one that's in checkout here, and we go over into our delivery method here, we should see a field that's called shipping instructions. We scroll down. It might be on one of the other ones under default delivery here, actually. Yep, here we go. And it's shipping instructions right here. And you can see that we've actually successfully updated that field with this value here. So that's exactly what we wanted to do. And you can kind of see the life cycle of how you're updating stuff in checkout and what that's doing to actually the cart record behind the scenes. With some of these related records in cart delivery groups and the cart items here. So that's kind of the understanding you'll need to have in order to make these components, which is why you can also do like DML and queries because they're at the end of the day just records. But one key call out here is you need to make sure that your components work with the one page and the accordion option if you want to use both of those. And you want to make sure that They're making updates to the respective areas here, which is going to be an important thing for kind of the life cycle of checkout. Thanks everyone for watching. Hopefully that was useful to see. A couple of examples, and I know there's a lot more out there that we can and should show. Let me know if there's anything else you want to see when it comes to LWR and checkout and the custom components here. Happy to do another version 2 of this with maybe a more complex example. But feel free to hit the like button, hit subscribe if this is your first time coming to our channel, and thank you everyone for watching.